Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. So this evening we have with us Ayasoma. So always lovely to have Ayasoma joining the live streams. And my name is Bhante Sudaso, and this evening we'll be doing a panel discussion on the topic of self-care. But first we can start with paying homage to the Buddha, and then we'll take it from there. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Buddhang Dhammang Sanghang Namasami. So we can start by inviting Ayasoma to introduce the topic and say a few words to get us going.
All right. Well, thank you, Bhante, for the invitation. So the topic tonight is self-care versus selfishness. So, what comes to mind is that a lot of times in spiritual practice, we can put actually our spiritual practice a little bit on the side when especially if we're not monastics and if we're lay people and we have lots of different responsibilities in the world and lots of also people that perhaps depend on us, like children, spouses, partners, and so forth, parents, family. Well, as monastics, we also have family, parents, and we also have the responsibilities of the people that we live with, usually the community. But obviously we have a little less sort of responsibilities than lay people. And usually, also at the monastery, we hear many people that go, I couldn't come or I can't stay here because I have to do this thing or this other thing. And sometimes actually, if they do take the time to perhaps go on retreat or do some meditation practice, there can be some guilt that kicks in, and perhaps some sense of selfishness of, this time could have been better used. Instead of working on my mind, I could have instead spent this time with my loved ones. I could have spent this time with my children or my family and so forth. And it's very interesting to first and foremost take this reflection and kind of understand what are the teachings of the Buddha when it comes to this, and why are we relating to spiritual practice in this way? That is a way that sometimes this question can come up with ourselves. And also, what is our understanding of spiritual practice to begin with, if we think that it's something that actually is distracting from perhaps our duties, from perhaps our way of relating to our families. And what comes to mind is actually a sutta that the Buddha says that there are 4 kinds of people. He says, the person who, for example, practices for their benefit and the benefit of others, the person who doesn't practice either for their benefit or for the benefit of others. And then there's the person who practices for their benefit, but not for the benefit of others. And then the person who practices not for their benefit, but for the benefit of others. And of course, the supreme person, he says, is the person who practices for their benefit and the benefit of others. And obviously the inferior person is the one who practices neither for their benefit nor for the benefit of others. But interestingly enough, between the other two ones that are left, he actually puts as supreme, as better, as foremost, the person who practices for their benefit and not for the benefit of others. So it can be a little bit counterintuitive, right, the Dhamma? So we think that actually, first and foremost, we do this. We should actually focus on always kind of giving, always kind of working for everyone else. And that if we're actually taking the time to cultivate the mind, if we're taking the time to do certain solitary practices that we might be detracting, but actually the Buddha perhaps is pointing to something else. And when we think of also how the Buddha oftentimes talks about the precepts, for example, holding the precepts, it's something that is definitely beneficial for ourselves. But the first that benefit actually are the ones around us. So there's not much difference actually in Buddhist practice, that whenever actually we are doing something for ourselves, the people around us benefit. And then actually when we're doing things for others, then it benefits ourselves ultimately. But if we're coming from a place where we are not actually working on ourselves, where we're not creating the conditions to cultivate the mind, then it will be very, very difficult to actually do the other step of essentially helping others. We will very soon run out of resources. And so, yes, when we think about actually anything, sila, samadhi, and panya, it's actually the biggest gift that we can give to everyone around us. And actually, I still remember our friend Belinda, actually. I don't know if she's watching right now, but if you are, hello, Belinda. Remember her, she used to come to our retreats in Brockway. And at the very beginning, she was struggling a little bit with this sense of guilt. And then her husband actually was really happy, even though he wasn't a practitioner, to see her coming out of retreat, and actually was encouraging her to come back, and was offering actually to take care of their children, and to take care of all the different chores in the house, not only to share the roles, but he was like, I'll take on more. Don't worry, you go and do your retreat thing. And why is that so? Because he was actually noticing how much happier actually his wife was becoming. And out of consequence, also, that was basically essentially, there was a trickle down effect in the entire family. So with her spouse and with all her children. So yeah, I feel like sometimes part of the practice is to understand actually what it is that we think that is selfish, what it is that we think that is selfless, what we think that it is self-care and the care of others, and somewhat reconfigure this in accordance with Dhamma rather than in accordance to what we think is correct, appropriate, what we're supposed to do, but rather see what are the consequences actually of my actions, and how are these impacting the people that surround me. And whenever we are taking care of ourselves, whenever we are actually establishing ourselves in Dhamma, it's a sort of win-win situation, I would say. So this is what comes to mind. I don't know if Ante would like to add something else.
Actually, that was so thorough that I don't really have too much to add to it. But one thing that I would say that comes to mind immediately, so when I hear about this topic, this idea of the difference between self-care and selfishness, is actually it's important to remember that the basic motivation of Buddhist practice is the wish to be free of suffering. So it's this basic compassionate wish to help at least one sentient being become free of suffering. And as we practice, as we work on freeing ourselves from suffering, eventually we realize that selfishness itself is at the very root of all of our suffering. So self-care naturally eventually leads to the targeting of our selfish tendencies. So it's actually is a very important element of Buddhist practice to recognize that if we want to be of benefit to others, if we want to be able to help others, that we always start with helping ourselves. But it's also important to remember that, again, in Buddhism, the wish is for everyone to be free of suffering, but it's not, may everyone else be free of suffering. Right? It's not, may everyone be free of suffering except me. So that's not what we're trying to do. In Buddhism, we're trying to help everyone become free of suffering. And the person who's right in the middle of all of this is always ourselves, or at least that's what it seems like to us unawakened beings. Those who are not yet fully awakened perceive themselves as being the center of the universe. One who is fully awakened has a somewhat different perspective on the matter. But for those who are not yet fully awakened, there's this perspective of like, well, there's this being right at the center of this enormous mass of suffering, this enormous mass of dukkha. So in order to understand this dukkha, in order to understand the causes of this dukkha, in order to relinquish, let go of those causes so that we can experience the ending of dukkha, even if just for a few moments, then we always start by looking at ourselves and asking, so what conditions in my life support the reduction of dukkha? What conditions in my life support the growth of wisdom? What conditions in my life support the development of samadhi, concentration? What conditions help me to develop virtue, morality? What conditions help me to cultivate all the wholesome qualities of mind that the Buddha speaks about? And sometimes the way that we do that is actually through taking a break from our responsibilities for a period of time. Sometimes actually the best way to make progress towards awakening is to go and take a nap. It's to recognize maybe that we've been pushing ourselves too hard and we're wearing ourselves out. And when we're worn out, then we're grumpy and we're irritable. And we try to deal with that irritability by seeking distraction or entertainment, or we lash out at people and spacey and distracted because we're not sleeping enough and we can't concentrate. And it's like, well, maybe then it's time to put some things down. And focus on reestablishing our own sense of serenity, our own sense of focus, to establish a sense of refreshment and ease in our own body and mind. And then from that basis of refreshment and ease, then we can build up our spiritual foundation. And when our spiritual foundation is well developed, then we can maintain our practice under these more challenging circumstances. So again, things like sleep deprivation or excessive busyness or health conditions or challenging personal interactions or things of that sort. But when we do find ourselves feeling a bit overwhelmed by what's going on in our life, it actually is completely reasonable to say like, okay, I do need to take a step back from this for at least a little while. I need to take a little break from this. I need to give myself the opportunity to refresh and recharge. And so this is a really important part of our practice. It's recognizing that, of course, optimally, we'll always maintain perfect equanimity under all conditions. Of course, that's the optimal scenario. But we have to be realistic. We have to be realistic about our actual limits. We have to be realistic about what's actually supportive to the growth of a wholesome mind under our current conditions. So not under ideal conditions, because ideal conditions are vanishingly rare, but under our actual conditions, what is going to support the growth of a wholesome mind. And again, the Buddha does also give a number of useful similes on this topic of self-care. So one of the famous ones that the Buddha gives is, he says, it's impossible for someone who's stuck in the mud to help somebody else get out of the mud. So you first need to get yourself free from the mud, and then you can help somebody else come out as well. Or a similar simile, which might be useful, is if you want to be a lifeguard in a swimming pool, well, you first need to learn how to swim. So a lifeguard who doesn't know how to swim isn't much good to anyone. They can't save other people who are drowning, and if they even try, they're just going to wind up getting in trouble themselves. And now there's two people who need help. So in the same way, we need to recognize that if we want to be able to help others, then we need to build up our own spiritual foundation. We need to really work on cultivating as much goodness within ourselves as we can. And the other one, of course, is the simile of the acrobats, where the Buddha makes the statement, when one helps oneself, one helps others. When one helps others, one helps oneself. So in this case, the Buddha is again pointing out how when we work on developing the supportive conditions for our own growth and wholesome qualities, then that naturally makes us of more benefit to other people, as Ayasoma was explaining a moment ago. And similarly, also when we look at the other people in our lives and look to see what we can do to help them out, well, that also supports our own practice, because it does reduce our selfishness. It does reduce our self-centeredness, our me-centric attitudes. It cultivates an attitude of attentiveness and carefulness and caring in the mind, which helps to diminish our self-centered attitudes and cultivates a sense of presence and alertness. So those are a few thoughts. Maybe Ayasoma, if you'd like to add anything to that.
Okay, thank you, Bante. Well, actually, I think there are a few comments, so maybe we can take these. First of all, hello to our friends online. Hello, Rick, Denise, Julie, Jayanta, Bhumika, Manal, Yankee, Anna Maria from Italy. That's very late. We're there. And then Sam, Elaine, Kim, Anthony, good to see you. Gita, Nan, Vidura, Yudi. And so Kim says, maybe Bante, do you want to read it?
This one?
Yeah.
It's a little bit off topic.
No.
Well, Kim says, Ajahn Sarano told about a monk complaining to Ajahn Chah that being sick was keeping him from practice, and Ajahn Chah replied that it is the practice. I've been under the weather and find myself being angry at everyone and everything. Would love to hear your thoughts. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's where actually mindfulness of feelings is really helpful to develop, because we then start understanding how we're constantly trying to relieve ourselves from this unpleasant feelings that we're having by making so much bad karma all the time. It's a little bit bizarre, but sometimes the body just feels unpleasant for so many different reasons. And that creates a lot of irritation, because we'd like to have, more pleasant feeling in the body. And we take it so seriously, the unpleasant feeling, that then we cultivate this irritation more and more and more, and then lash out. So the important thing is kind of really, at least what I try to do for myself is, and this was very noticeable actually during the Tudong practice that we did. It was very, very difficult, hard on the body, and consequentially also hard on the mind. Because the body felt really unpleasant most of the time, actually. Whether even during sleeping, actually was quite cold, and it was, the body could feel so unpleasant. And being underslept, there were so many strong Vedanas, strong sensations. And then the mind would become a little bit grumpy and groggy, and there's this tension, this fight. But because everything was so intense, it was just kind of easier to pinpoint the fact that there was literally just a reaction to a physical sensation. And when one has that insight, one has that awareness that is just just a physical sensation. Also the irritation, the kind of habit of irritation towards the unpleasant Vedana becomes less serious in the mind. And then that kind of anger doesn't have that much sort of fertile soil and water and moisture where to germinate. So it kind of like becomes weaker and weaker and starts somewhat like, kind of maybe it sprouts a little bit, but then we don't water it and it just dies on its own. If someone has ever grown seedlings, this can be a very good visual. I remember actually when I was, doing some seedlings, I killed many of them back in the day with a really not green thumb. So we want to have that not green thumb with our kilesas as well. We probably planted in the past and we've watered them, and and they come and they sprout. But then when we identify them, we see them, we're like, yeah, well, I really just don't need to water this anymore. Like, just let it go. And it just has no conditions where to grow more solid. So yeah, don't take yourself too seriously. There's anger rising in the mind. Oh, well, it's arising. Just don't fuel it. And poof, it will just kind of disappear. Don't take it too seriously. This is what comes to mind. I don't know if you have any other
I think that's
suggestions.
Good. Yeah. And Yudi, it's just a comment. It's not a question.
Okay.
Yeah, Denise says, Dhamma practice removes a lot of self-disparaging narratives from the heart and mind, slowly but surely. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, it's great practice.
Yeah. Yuri asks, does helping others include birds? I feed gulls and pigeons at the beach daily. I also care for their wounds and remove threads that cut into their skin. It makes me feel good after, but my mother said I wasn't going to heaven for feeding and caring for a bird. I mean, I'd rather be reborn as a human to practice Dhamma. So to me, it is like a self-care for myself. Well, I can't comment on what your mother was saying because she's, from a Buddhist standpoint, she's actually completely wrong. Because to care for any sentient being produces very strong good karma. And good karma can lead to rebirth in heaven. Though if one has a strong aspiration to be reborn as a human practicing Dhamma, then one is likely to have those conditions. So the Buddha does talk about how the aspirations that we make is one of the determining factors in where we're reborn. So yes, absolutely, helping animals is also an important element of cultivating compassion and practicing good karma. And yes, it does create the necessary causal conditions for directing one's rebirth. So if one doesn't have any particular aspiration, then actually, yes, it can lead to being reborn in heaven. And if one has an aspiration to be reborn in optimal conditions for practicing Dhamma, then the good karma that comes through helping other sentient beings will also support the fulfillment of that aspiration. So I actually think it's really beautiful that you go to help birds, especially gulls and pigeons, which many people regard as nuisances. But it's good to remember that all sentient beings are just like us. They have minds, they have thoughts, they have emotions, they have hopes and dreams, they have pleasure and pain, they have confusion and clarity, and they all just want to be happy, just like everybody else. So actually have a lot of compassion for the animals that others look down upon, like pigeons and rats and ants and so on. So these are spiders, Mosquitoes are admittedly a little bit challenging for me still, but I'm also mosquitoes as time goes by, compassion grows. So yeah, I think it's wonderful that you do this practice, and I would encourage you to keep it up and don't worry too much about what your mom has to say on the matter. Do you have any thoughts?
Yes, similarly to Bante, I'm very moved by your practice of taking care of birds. It's really sweet and adorable. And yeah, what a blessing, especially removing the threads that cut into their skins. Oh, that is, yeah, bless your heart. Keep doing that. And yeah, what comes to mind is, we use a lot of times this word kind of self-care in secular settings, and so it's kind of interesting to use it now in a Buddhist setting, because perhaps we're kind of relating it to self-help, and maybe I just need to relax myself or do this or whatever, has a bit of a worldly sense. And especially in Buddhism, where we talk so much about anatta, so non-self, then we can think, oh, well, let's discard this self altogether. And it's very important to reflect that before getting to the place of being capable of understanding anatta, one needs to cultivate a good atta. So in that sense, we should take care of this self, which already, we have definitely a sense of self. And that sense of self has so many different, kusala and akusala traits. So ideally, you want to actually develop a really kusala self. And then once that is very well developed, we can, toss it out. We can lay it out, because we'll have created the conditions to truly see that, yeah, it's dependently arisen, to truly understand that that is not our true self in and of itself. But it's, of course, a journey. And yes, everything that essentially cultivates that mind of compassion, that mind of wisdom, the mind of caring, that mind of generosity, that mind of, of stillness, of the beautiful mind, everything essentially contributes to caring for that self in a way that is kusala, that is skillful. And so I would say that helping others, helping any sentient being, whether it's human or non-human, whatever warms the heart, whatever gets you to a place of opening up to, making your mind more of a divine abode, so to speak, then yes, please, by all means, take care of that mind.
Okay. And Anthony says, I shared the sutta about the 4 kinds of people with my mom, and she really loves it. She can neglect self-care. It was important for me to hear the sutta too.
Yeah, for me as well. Thank you, Anthony, for sharing that, and also for sharing it with your mom. It's one of the interesting things, being back in Italy. Actually, I shared that with some of the Italian friends as well, because in Catholicism, there's so much, actually, there's so many beautiful things that are taught, so much beautiful generosity. And there is a big sense of sacrifice, actually. And that has its pros and cons. And so there's many pros, obviously, to being so generous, but there can be also some cons in forgetting, as Bhante was mentioning, one person in the equation. So as the Buddha always says, and as Bhante always repeats, it's everyone be happy. That includes ourselves. That includes that one person. So it's very important, yes, to bring that to mind and recollect that, which was probably also, I think, in the original teachings of Christianity as well, I assume, because one of the commandments, this was actually, this reflection was brought up to me by one of the Italian folks a few weeks ago. And that lady was like, yeah, actually, the commandment says, love your neighbor like yourself. So we forgot the like yourself part. What happened to that? So if there's a lot of self-hatred, well, then you're probably gonna hate your neighbor like yourself. Doesn't really work that way. So sometimes even, you know, in the tradition, we can get a little bit confused.
And Rick says, due to living with chronic pain and illness, I need extra sleep and rest to maintain physical, mental, and spiritual wellness. However, this results in not being able to keep up with the care for my house and property. How does self-care offer skillful guidance? Well, first off, I would just recognize that if you need a certain amount of rest in order to maintain your health, then you need a certain amount of rest in order to maintain your health. And if that means you have less time in order to look after your possessions and so on, well, then that means you have less time to look after your possessions. So if that's the condition that you have, then that's how it is. So it's important also just to recognize the limitations that we're faced when, especially when dealing with physical problems. So for example, I'm not about to go out and run a marathon. It just isn't a possibility for me. So I'm not going to beat myself up for not being able to run a marathon. I just accept that's something I can't do right now. So similarly, if you find that your physical health problems prevent you from doing certain activities, well, then you just accept that that's the condition you're in and don't expect more from yourself. So just as I don't expect myself to run a marathon, then don't expect more of yourself than you're actually capable of. So being content to do what you're capable of doing, and whatever you do engage in, do so with mindfulness and equanimity. And then what is beyond your current capabilities, well, then you just accept that that's not something you can do right now. And there's no shame in that. There's no shame in admitting that you're facing certain limits. Okay.
Okay, and Sudha says, did you read it?
The kakukama, probably kakachupama, the simile of the saw is what I would guess he's referring to. Anyway, in this sutta, the Buddha talks about being like the earth or making the mind like the Ganges. Yeah, kakachupama sutta, the simile of the saw. Or even if they sever one limb from limb, to not lose loving kindness. How does this play into situations where one may be facing situations that would annoy one? Not talking about verbal or physical abuse, but rather annoyance. Would you show kindness to yourself and accept or avoid situations that would annoy one? But then if you avoid, then you cannot get rid of the defilement. Ayasoma, what do you think?
That, I mean, if it's not that the practice is just endurance. This is very clear in the Sabbasava Sutta, actually. I remember when I first encountered the Sabbasava Sutta, I was like, it didn't occur to me that I had to, like, you know, have different strategies in accordance to different situations. You know, it's not that I can avoid everything. It's not that I can endure everything. And like a lot of the times with practice, we try to endure what needs to be avoided and avoid what needs to be endured. Like, for example, we try to avoid eating when we can't avoid eating, you know, like we just need to, for example, train ourselves, reflect on how to eat, so to speak. So actually that's, well, not in the not the thing to endure, but rather to avoid, but rather to understand, to contemplate skillfully each time that we are introducing it, because we vitally depend on it. And when it comes to, for example, poisonous situations or terrible, like harmful people or harmful beings, you know, for example, if there is a poisonous snake, or if there's a wild elephant. Actually, the Buddha doesn't say, hey, go there and like just be full of loving kindness and and go and pet them. No, he says, leave, go away. Avoid. Yeah, that's not to be faced. That's not something that one wants to intentionally get into it. So yeah, to a certain degree, if we have the ability to avoid a certain situation, we should avoid it, a situation that is harmful. If we can't avoid it, well, we have to understand how we can go about it in the most skillful of ways, essentially. And so it's very interesting, actually, when it comes to, for example, people who are quite intense, perhaps they are insulting us or whatever. A lot of the times it's not really the interaction that we're having, but rather all the value that we're giving to the words. It was very clear to me a lot of times in Italy, since I don't look Italian. Dressed like this, and I was traveling with the other venerables that definitely don't look Italian, so both with or without the robe. So myself, by association, I didn't look Italian, so people around me would often feel very free to make certain comments or speak very, very freely when we were walking around. And very rarely, actually, we've been insulted. And it was very interesting because I was noticing how, all the other venerables, well, they didn't know the language, so they were completely, unfazed. And I was, on the other hand, like having a strong reaction, and sometimes they would ask me, like, what is wrong with you? Like, why did you react in that way or the other way? And it was very interesting to realize how the only reason, essentially, we were having the same experience, but the only reason why I was having a different reaction was because I was actually having a different perception. I was giving there was basically a lot of papancha that was arising based on that small interaction. So I feel like sometimes actually the Mahasi method, this is where it's really, really useful. Because then in interactions like that, you can just go like, listening, hearing, irritation, and kind of like just label it and just drop it. Anyway, so this is kind of like a stream of consciousness that comes to mind, and maybe Matthew can give more direct advice.
Yeah, I mean, I think as Ayasoma was saying, we're not obligated to go out of our way to put ourselves into challenging situations, but it is important to consider when something actually is within the strength of our practice and we're just avoiding it because we can't be bothered, versus when something actually is going to be too challenging for us and we're just going to wind up backsliding. So because it is a certain part of our practice is about pushing our limits and training the mind to face challenging situations. So, I mean, Tudong practice is a great example of this. It's deliberately putting ourselves in a very challenging situation. And the result is a growth in equanimity. But it is important to know when a situation is actually going to support our growth and when it's just going to support our dosa. So being realistic about, again, what's supportive versus what leads to decline. And Yuri says, thank you. I feel better that I'm doing the right thing. I feel so much love towards these birds, like I am part of them. People say to me, don't feed them or they have germs. Well, humans also have germs. So following this logic, it would seem that you also shouldn't feed humans. In fact, you might actually need to completely avoid humans altogether. So I'm honestly, this logic comes from people not relating to animals as sentient beings. So, and I've actually met many non-Buddhists who are actually really puzzled by this perspective. They're really puzzled by the fact that I regard animals as sentient beings. And even sometimes when people first get into Buddhism, it takes them a little while to adapt to this way of thinking. Yeah, so sometimes you can explain that to people. You can explain that you see animals as being sentient, just like human beings, and therefore you value them just like you value humans. Hopefully, you also value humans. But you also just accept that some people, they're just not going to see the world this way, and there's not really anything you can do about that. So you just keep doing what you know is right. Okay.
And she also said, how can they be so selfish? Well, I would say that it's not necessarily a question of being selfish, but rather, as Bante was explaining just now, of wrong view. So we all have wrong view to a certain extent or the other. It's just usually, focused in one particular area of operation. It's actually very refreshing when one thinks that, if, like, for example, the people in this room like merged together, we would have an enlightened being. We'd also have Mara, but we'd also but it's quite remarkable, no? You're like, wow, it's pretty incredible how we've all, have some traits that are really developed, some areas of operation that are really developed, and some others where we're completely blind and completely, sort of behind. So usually when we're very developed in one area, one skill set, we're kind of like, wow, how can you really not do that? It's not different than any other skill set. Like, for example, if we're really good at drawing and we see people that are not capable of drawing, we're like, wow, how is it possible that you can't even do a straight line? Actually, forget about straight, like even wobbly. Like, what is wrong with you? Or singing, like people who are tone deaf. Like, wow, is it possible that you're so bad at singing? Right? But then when we are the people who are tone deaf, or we're the people who don't know how to draw, then we're kind of like, well, it's just really difficult. I don't know. Like, it's not something that I happen to have this ability. So it's the same when we think about the mind, things that are not that, sort of worldly, so to speak. If we think of it in those more worldly terms, like just how we relate to drawing or singing or so forth, because we can be a little less judgmental. Maybe at the very beginning we're surprised, but then we're like, okay, yeah, of course. Well, there's people who have different skill sets. I'm really bad at math, and other people's are really good at math, and so forth. Well, maybe you can understand that too. Oh, some people are really good at compassion. Some people are really good at wisdom. Some people are really good at sila, keeping the precepts and so forth. Like, there's different skill sets that we have, and we don't take it personally, but rather we just keep on doing what we're doing, and hopefully that will inspire others as well, and that will help them also overcome their kind of blind spots.
And Mary says, I'm healing from surgery this morning and need to learn self-care. It is also nice to receive care from my family instead of always being the caregiver.
Sadhu. Yeah. Very, very happy that the surgery went well, Mary. Very good.
Yeah, and I would also say that it's actually a gift to others to let them take care of you, and to learn how to be easy to look after. So this is one of the reflections that we have in monastic life, is to be easy to take care of, easy for others to look after. So also in lay life, it's similar. When you're in situations where maybe you're sick, or in your case, recovering from surgery, or when one becomes elderly and one needs more help from others. Well, recognize that we're giving other people an opportunity to make merit. We're giving other people a chance to cultivate their own goodness of heart, and to express their goodness through looking after us when we need it. And also to ask ourselves, how can I make it easier for them to look after me? So to be easy to take care of, easy to support, but also making sure that we're not preventing others from having the chance to help us. So it's actually a gift to others to give them the opportunity to help you out when it's needed. And you get to also rejoice in the goodness of others. As you said, it's nice to receive care from your family. Well, you can also take that as a chance to cultivate gratitude and appreciation for the others who look after you. So this is an opportunity to cultivate another side of generosity practice.
Yes, the Anumodana practice is very, very good, very central also to Buddhism. I've been thinking about it a lot actually while we were in Italy. So yeah, how important it is to know how to receive, because without people receiving, there is no giving. And so also the consideration of like whenever we're trying to give something to someone and that person makes it very difficult for us to give, or impedes the giving, how like, it becomes a little bit wah-wah for us, like we're not really that happy. So bringing that to mind actually can make it a little bit easier to accept, rather than thinking, oh, okay, someone is giving something to me, I don't need anything, I'm completely self-sufficient, I'm an independent, blah, 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 blah. Instead, we can go, oh, what a great opportunity that I'm giving this person to make merit. And by merit, we're meaning cultivating the mind. Like, how wonderful, how great. We're giving them a gift of happiness. So we're also giving in that case. And Rick says, hey, this is
says, can you share some practical ways we can act with skillful self-care and compassion and not get caught up in unhealthy caretaking when helping others? Well, again, it's always paying attention to your own condition, to your own needs. So when you're overextending yourself, then you'll feel that. You'll feel the decrease in your own capacity, decrease in your own health, or decrease in your own mental, emotional stability, or you can see it in yourself when you're overextending yourself, when you're helping others to the point where it becomes self-sacrifice. So again, recognizing that in Buddhism, we're not trying to practice self-sacrifice, but rather we're trying to lift everyone up at the same time, and that always includes ourselves. So again, it's about watching to see the effects your actions have on yourself, as well as the effects it has on others. Okay. And Laura says, to follow up on Mary Burns' question, how can we make it easier for others to take care of us? How can we become easier to take care of? Well, actually, one thing I would say is to be willing to express your needs clearly and kindly. So if we don't talk about our needs, then it's actually just makes it harder for the people who are trying to take care of us. If people don't know how to care for us, then they have to try to figure it out, which isn't always the easiest thing. So be willing to speak clearly about what your needs are, but also don't ask for more than you need. So don't be demanding, but at the same time be clear about what you need and how others can help you. That's what comes to mind. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that's pretty.
Jessica says, do you believe being a good parent is similar to being a monastic, in that it is selfless and difficult to take time or not feel bad about self-care?
Well, I mean, as a monastic, we actually, I mean, we clearly go forth to make spiritual practice the focus of our life. This also means we're taking care of others as we are upon this quest of awakening, because obviously, as we've said since the very beginning, it's inevitable, it's mutual. That's also why the precepts are so interestingly crafted by the Buddha, and in the way that if we're actually following the Vinaya, like the monastic code, we are completely dependent from lay people. So physiologically, essentially, just out of the survival of the body, we just can't go, maybe we can skip a couple of days, go without food. But eventually we can't starve ourselves. So we'll have to be constantly in touch with lay people, which then creates, hopefully a nice relationship of growth, of mutual support in the Dhamma, in the path. So the parallel with parenthood can sometimes come, actually, I would say, when one is living in the same place for a long period of time. I think actually there can be similarly to actually parenthood, some unhealthy dynamics that can happen between monastics and lay people, just like there can happen between parents and children. So actually the Buddha is quite clear in the suttas that there are all these stories of like, monastics that then start sobbing with the lay people when the lay people are sobbing, and then cheering with the lay people when the people are cheering, and getting a little bit too tangled up. And that, in worldly ways, we tend to think of that, oh, that's such a great monastic, like so much caring for the the lay people, that knows all their, nuts and bolts of all their personal lives. But yeah, actually, that's not the duty of a monastic. And actually, that should also not be the duty of a parent. It's obviously a little bit more difficult because, if one is a parent, obviously, it will be in a constant sort of, at least for a period of time, their daily, they will be very close to their children and see them on a regular basis. But ideally, we are trying to develop love without attachment. And so the love is something that we need to nourish, to cherish. So acting for the welfare of others. But the attachment, so getting too personal, too icky, too much into the lives of others, where then we want to control them and we suffer if it doesn't go in the way that we want. That's what we need to work on separating the two and tossing the attachment and keeping on growing the love. So to a certain degree, yes. I mean, there's monastic path and the lay path are parallel paths. The dynamics are very similar and very different at the same time. So, it's kind of like, it's no different than the clothing. We also wear clothing, but clearly it's very simple clothing and it's only one. So the relationship also to what one is wearing will be similar in the sense of the defilements that will arise in the mind. It's just that as a monastic, it's easier to identify them because, for example, attachment to clothing, when you're attached to rags, you kind of like really at a certain point have to realize that you're attached to rags, and that it's quite ridiculous, isn't it, to be attached to rags. So opposed to when one is a lay person and is attached to, big brands and this and that and whatever, this type of cloth versus this other type of cloth. And there's a million different types of cloth in one's wardrobe. Perhaps I even know people who have an apartment for all their clothing, like an extra apartment right next to their apartment. Real stories. So if it's so much, then one can get, confused, can get a little bit distracted. So monastic life is designed in order to be able to see, this more clearly. And so obviously, yes, we have kind of parent-child sort of relationships sometimes with lay people, but we're not, genetically related. We haven't had them in our bellies. We haven't spoon-fed people. So there's that kind of distance, that kind of way of that at a certain point you realize, maybe this is not actually that it's just easier to somewhat remove ourselves.
Okay. And Elstacia says, I've been grieving the loss of a friend. I feel unable to move past it. Any advice on how to view or deal with this loss? I feel stuck and overly vulnerable and messy at the same time. Well, first off, just acknowledging that it's completely normal to feel, as you put it, stuck and overly vulnerable and messy. That's actually completely expected when one is dealing with grief. So in this case, the loss of a friend. That's going to produce a lot of emotional discomfort and awkwardness. So the first thing is just being willing to be completely present with what you're going through. So paying attention to the mental and emotional conditions that you're going through, and acknowledging that this is completely normal, completely natural. It's the result of a cause and effect process, just like everything else. And also recognizing that it's impermanent. It's changing. So you can watch as it's always changing. And also over time, things tend to diminish and fade away and move into different directions. And through observing this process, you can also get some deeper understanding into the nature of the mind, into the nature of desire and attachment, into the nature of expectation, into the nature of how the mind produces experiences, and also how we generate suffering in relation to the experiences that we have in our life. And this also can be a basis for compassion, and that you can reflect that this is not something that's unique to you, but actually literally every single person in the entire world experiences grief at some point in their life, and usually at many points in their lives. This is a normal part of the experience of sentient beings. So through paying attention to your own process of grief, then you can cultivate a deeper empathy and compassion for others who are going through similar things. Those are a few thoughts. Do you have anything you want to say on this?
Yeah, just remembering that this is essentially part of the First Noble Truth. That is essentially, dukkha, old age, sickness, and death. If there wasn't this aspect, we wouldn't be really investing too much time in the spiritual practice, right? So being separated from those who are dear to us, this is very, very, very difficult, very, very traumatic. And that is part of, as Bhante said, that's essentially the predicament in samsara that we are in, by one birth, get old age, sickness, and death free. So it's really sad. And it's just the way things are. And, it's very important to remember that the Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths, not the one noble truth, the two noble truths, the three noble truths, but the Four Noble Truths. And he dedicated as much time to each one of them. So it's important to really investigate what it is, what grief is, what death is, what is this process. And it takes, of course, you're going to be vulnerable and messy at the same time, because that is essentially the First Noble Truth. There is dukkha. It's just that we constantly forget about it, right? So when we're not forced to face this predicament, then we're kind of like, oh, Everything is, we delude ourselves that everything is somewhat going great. But the reality is, as Bhante said, that this is full. We go out and we see death everywhere. It's quite mind-opening when we see that. So be gentle with yourself and understand that, of course, until awakening, this will be very difficult. It will be, obviously, there will still be dukkha. And we can always reflect, ask ourselves, where is that dukkha? How is it manifesting, that dukkha? And yeah, the First Noble Truth is a truth. It's something that invites us to come and see for ourselves.
Okay. And Shadow of Label has a question which I think is a bit off topic, maybe better for monk chat tomorrow. And Manal says, what would be your best advice for parents to offer their adolescent children on the subject of self-care? As a household practitioner, it's often challenging to skillfully teach. Well, again, it's, first off, recognize that your ability to teach anything to others depends upon the extent to which you've cultivated it yourself. So if you want to be able to teach your children how to take care of themselves, how to skillfully manage their emotions, how to skillfully manage their physical, mental, and emotional health, how to know where to draw lines and boundaries and so on, well, then that's something that you need to make sure that's well developed within yourself. So actually the best way to learn how to teach self-care to your children is to work on developing equanimity and self-awareness within yourself. So the more strongly you build up your own spiritual foundation, the easier it will be for you to help your children learn how to develop their own hearts. Just some general advice. I don't know, do you have anything else you want to add?
That's good.
Okay. And I don't see any other questions online. Are there any questions from the in-person attendance? Any other questions? No?
Oh, there's Anagarika Saran.
Ah.
Good to see you, Anagarika. Oh, and hello also to Antonia, also in Italy.
Oh, great.
Middle of the night. Dear Venerables, how to know if it is time to establish boundaries to people or time to practice patience and compassion?
Well, again, you need to consider what your own limits are. So whether a situation is going to be supportive to your spiritual growth, supportive to the development of wholesome mental states, or if it's just going to be too challenging and it's going to wind up irritating you or frustrating you or making you backslide. And in the case of setting boundaries with people, well, again, we need to consider if somebody is prone to stepping over boundaries, well, examine those boundaries. If they're really important boundaries, then actually we do need to stick to them, stick firmly to them. But actually, if it's something that's not so important, then sometimes being a little bit flexible with people and practicing patience, sometimes that's the right option. But it's, again, it varies depending upon the specific conditions. So we always have to examine our own conditions and figure out for ourselves where it is right to say, like, okay, this is the limit. This is too far. I'm not going to put myself in that kind of situation. And where we can say, actually, this is within the limits of my ability to grow my practice, to grow wholesome states of mind. So it's a constant process of self-investigation and self-awareness. So this depends upon the strength of one's own self-awareness. So this is a necessary component of understanding one's practice. Okay.
Great.
And it looks like that's the last question. So I think we can go ahead and end at this time with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you all next time.